Hey, happy Wednesday. Happy Women Seeking Wholeness Wednesday. If you are, in fact, listening to this the day we go live every week, the day we debut our episode, this is episode 121, Say Yes to the Mess. Now, this honestly is one of my favorite interviews to date. Monica and I just were going back and forth, spot on around this whole and you can even go to my website and see in my about section, your mess is your message. That's been my credo ever since I heard it. I don't know when or where I heard it, but now you hear it a lot because it's just real. It's true. Whatever you're here to amplify, magnify, create, what have you, is chaotic and messy sometimes. So today is all about giving that permission to descend into the chaos and the mess. In this episode with Monica, we talk a lot about the portal that you enter into self-love and liberation by the willingness that you have to get messy and not have everything perfect. But I want to introduce to you Monica Rodgers. She is giving women this impetus to take action, realizing their true potential only when they stop proving, striving, trying so hard, right? To just do and be what everybody wants. She believes that when we become true to ourselves and return to our original design with love and compassion, we become aligned and open the portal into our divine purpose where peace, joy, and prosperity dwells. She's the podcast host of the Revelation Project, and I'm getting ready to be a guest on her show. She actually interviews people who challenge alternative narratives to traditional patriarchal influences and investigates vulnerable and courageous topics that reveal the deeper and often hidden truths. So this is a little bit longer episode. It's well worth the listen. So let's get it started. All right, Monica.
Hey.
You and I can already tell, even though we really don't know each other, we just met. I can already tell we think the same. I'm looking, we just talked about this before we started recording, but I'm looking at all your books behind you. I'm like, oh, a woman after my heart. So many books.
So many books, all the books. I know.
And you have a podcast called The Revelation Project.
I do indeed.
And so you know the game, not game, that sounds weird, but you know how it works where you just, things align, people meet. Sometimes you don't even know why you have a guest on. And then as the conversation progresses, it's like, oh yeah, we were supposed to coincide. And even with just our pre-conversation, I can already tell this is going to be yummy. So let's start, because you and I have a shared passion for the divine feminine and also for women stepping forward and getting out of their own way and just kind of claiming their own worthiness. You have a path with that. You have a journey that's led you to become super passionate around giving women the go ahead, the permission to be you're already worthy, you're already there. What was the, catalyst or turning point for you to get to where you're now basing your whole trajectory on this, right? This is your thing.
Yeah, it's my thing.
What brought you there in your personal life? Whatever you feel comfortable sharing.
Oh, I feel comfortable sharing everything. I mean, it's so funny because I'm it is the Revelation Project, right? So it's full transparency for me. In fact, I kind of love the messy truth. So I'll start with really just saying that for me, it was almost having to lose my life to choose my life. I would say that like many women, I had been wearing all of the masks of perfection. I had created that picture perfect image, right? I had the perfect husband, the perfect house, the white picket fence, I was an entrepreneur, the kids, right? And I was absolutely exhausted. I was confused. I was overwhelmed, deeply, deeply unhappy. And I had made it look so damn good that when everything did actually fall apart, nobody knew that there had ever been an issue. Mm-hmm. And, at that point, unfortunately, I was suicidal. I had probably, I think for all of us, right, there comes a time or not where we get to decide if we're going to continue the facade. Yeah. And for me, it just became so intolerable. And I always say that intolerance is an ally. It's one of our biggest allies as women. Like, to become intolerant is a good
can't
thing.
do it anymore. You can. There, you like
No.
it's the straw. I said the straw that broke the camel's back.
Sometimes
we all
the
have
bra. Yeah,
it could be the bra. So it became like you just couldn't do it anymore.
Oh my God. I could not do it anymore. And I knew it was like I was pretending not to know, right? Because we can do that too. We can pretend not to know for a long time. And so the signs kept coming, right? Like being in a bookstore and having literally like the Mary Oliver poem book like fall on my shoulder. And I open it up and it's the poem, The Journey, right?
Oh, I love her work. Yeah.
So there were signs like that, like along the way where, I always marvel at the synchronicity of the universe and how, like, when the goddess is ready for you to awaken, she's just like, she'll warn you, she'll gently nudge you, she'll throw a book at you, right? All the things until like, she's like, all right, Kali, like, so be it. And you get the universal smackdown, right? And that was it. It was literally like it was coinciding with the last economic crash, which was around 2008, 2009. And at that point, I had raised venture capital. I was like building an empire on quicksand. You know what I mean? Like I had no foundation for everything that I was building because underneath was all a lie, really. I mean, I wasn't being true to myself. And I don't think I was even willing to admit that to myself yet.
Sure.
Yeah. So it ended up being almost 9 months in bed, which I think is interesting because it's how long it takes to birth a human. To gestate. And that was kind of like a rebirth experience for me, was kind of coming back to life after that experience and having kind of a new understanding of like what my purpose is. And of course I didn't have it all at once, but it continued to be revealed over time. And I feel like, the Revelation Project found me more than me finding her.
Yeah. I love you refer to it as her. So when you were in bed, did you feel like that was a time of regrouping? Like, did you feel like you were getting downloads? Did you feel like, or was it straight up depression where you felt foggy? Or did you feel like you were being sustained in a way? Probably a mixture of both, I'm assuming, most of us, when we get into that.
Yeah, which is so making me so curious about yours. But it was both. It was, there were times where it was just sleep, right? I did have 2 small children. So when everything fell apart, it included my marriage, my home, my business, like all of it. And so my kind of sole purpose at that time was to make sure that the kids were cared for. I had them in an early childhood program in a Waldorf educational kind of situation, which I was so blessed to have had. And I would literally like get them in their program and like come home, be in bed all day and get them from school, get them fed, back into bed, right? There were times though that I was kind of having these almost like lightly sleeping, but like dreaming. And I thought I was dreaming, but I think so much more was going on. Sure. And, and I had these very interesting experiences. And in fact, toward the end, and I don't know if you saw that the logo is a butterfly, but when you look closer, it's 2 faces looking at each other. And
that's like the Rorschach inkblot test or whatever. I can see it now.
Yeah.
I didn't see it before. I just thought it was a pretty butterfly, but you're right. Yeah. And it's feminine.
Yeah. Right. And so at the end, that image was etched in my mind because there was a way that I had, in what I thought was a dream, I was hovering over my bed. And I had this experience where I had been dreaming almost about, it was almost like like a deep dive into the underworld where I was going and reclaiming the pieces of myself I had abandoned along the way. And at the very end of that experience, I will never forget, it was this very emotional, deeply emotional experience for me of taking my own, finally, like taking my own face into my own hands and kissing my own face and like welcoming myself, like coming back home to myself, like forgiving myself for for abandoning myself all those years. Right. And when I hovered over myself in this dream-like state, there I was in the bed. It was like, there was me on one side and me on the other side in these mirror images. And it looked like a butterfly from up above. And the amazing thing, because of course, this is how the universe works when you're ready, is that right before I had gone to bed for that period of time, I had had this incredible experience with my daughter of watching a butterfly emerge that we had had in a chrysalis on kind of the windowsill. And she had come and woken me up in the morning and she was like, "Mommy, it's time," and the butterfly was sure enough coming out of the chrysalis. And we had this magical experience this morning, and I got to capture it in photographs of like its wings were still wet. But when I look back at the images, my daughter is wearing this little bracelet. It's a wishing bracelet and it says breathe. And I was like, oh my God, like the breath is spirit. And I had lost my spirit, right, for so long. It was like I had been, we talked about the fact that growing up Catholic, you would have thought that would have deepened my connection. Yeah. And I'm going to circle back to that in a second. But when I think about what was really true for me about noticing that bracelet, was I recognized that I had stopped breathing. Like I was always air hungry. I was always like
gasping.
Yeah. Like, why can I not just breathe? Right. Like, why am I always gasping for air?
That is the first thing that goes as a signal to our physiology, to our spirit. Like you said, I'm freaking out that you said breath is spirit, because I literally did a post on Instagram like 3 days ago that said breath is spirit. That is typically, and I was never taught this, a whole psychology degree, a whole religious upbringing, everything. Right? Like, when were we ever taught that spirit rides on the breath? And I think it's very feminine, but keep going. So feminine. It is.
Absolutely. And yeah, so it, like I was writing about the experience, of almost like when my world fell apart. I had this, it was like I could finally breathe again. It was like, oh, thank God, like bring on the mess. Like finally, there was this part of me, there was honestly this aspect of myself that was almost giddy at the prospect of like metaphorically, like throwing all the shit that wasn't working into this fire, right? Because I was so tired of trying to hold it all together. And I think, to kind of segue into where I think so many of us women are kind of mistakenly duped into holding it all together, holding the world all together, when what we really need to do is like give ourselves permission to let it all fall apart. Because I think unconsciously we keep a lot of not only the facade in place, but the system, which I call patriarchy, in place, which is all of the systemic intersections of isms that
it's like the collection of traditions that have gotten us into the mess we're in now. That's my definition of patriarchy. I don't necessarily think it has to do with men in general. No, it's systemic. Yeah. So you're in bed and you're having these beautiful, almost like dissociative experiences, probably altered states of consciousness to prepare you for your work. Sometimes that, what I have found in the people I've worked with and in myself, that, we're taught that it's not spiritual to be messy. And then all of a sudden our body stops us. Like, if you're not going to stop, I will stop you, which is such a beautiful healing gesture. that we have gone into all these avoidance mechanisms to actually, avoid stopping. But you have kids to take care of. You have, things to do. For me, I was a very functional, like I didn't stay in bed all, and whatever. I would have to nap and do different things, which was like, I've even felt guilty about taking a nap. I still kind of do sometimes, but it was more, when I've come to the realization now is because, and I don't know what your family history is, and we can get to that later. But because of my religious upbringing, because of my family patterning, I literally, let me back up. It was, severe depression in women, mothers, suicide. I lost a sister to suicide and an aunt. Both of them were mothers. My own mother struggled with depression a lot as I was growing up, but she was in bed a lot for a period of time. But I think I formed this thing very young. And I think it's why I even went into psychology to begin with, that if I just kept working and I kept being busy and doing things and producing and achieving, I would never get depression. So whenever it felt like it was like there, I would work harder. And it became this avoidance mechanism that I didn't have the awareness of, that if I actually stopped, I would be overcome. The dark clouds would just come in and I would be overtaken and I would suffocate. So the lie in that, and what I know now about emotional healing, which I actually have known all along that I didn't apply to myself, was that when you lay in the mess and you let those emotions come up, that's the only way that they're going to heal. Mm-hmm. By working harder, I was exacerbating and prolonging, not only the patterns, but the health stuff. I was getting sick. I was getting sicker. So it didn't look like clinical depression, right? Mm-hmm. So for you, when you had that, what brought you out of bed? What was the catalyst that was like, okay, and thank gosh I had kids too, like younger kids, because that does move you.
It does move you.
You have to do stuff. Right?
I know. It does. And, and I think everybody experiences it differently, but I love what you were pointing to, because I think I was similar. And I think a lot of women are, that like the busyness keeps us in that pattern of avoidance. Right. And it's like that, it's the pretending not to know, right? It's kind of right there. But what got me out is actually like a series of miracles happened, and I think that we're willing to so again, to kind of go back to like how I was raised, so my mother actually left the convent to marry my father. So
very Catholic then. Mm-hmm.
Very Catholic. And continued to be. She was his scrub nurse. He was a vascular surgeon, and it was the St. John Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. Mm-hmm. And she was his scrub nurse. And there's a longer story there, but to kind of come back to what got me out of bed, because miracles and prayer took on a completely different consciousness, awareness to me, because how I had been taught to pray and what it was in a religious context and what it became for me in a spiritual context, and that it literally rose out of me as like as a longing, as a crying out, right? As a calling to something that I knew at that point there was something bigger than me. There were too many synergies. There were too many things happening. Too many
synchronicities for it to be coincidence.
Right. And
I don't believe in coincidences anymore, by the way.
Absolutely not. And actually, and this, you might find this interesting. When I went back and I started to really research the Gnostic texts before kind of the formation of, okay, you're like, yes.
Oh, that's my jam.
People are like, okay, good. So is this whole understanding of like, that the story of Jesus as an allegory, that actually it's all about the story of becoming conscious. And it's not like I'm sitting here saying like, you must believe this, right? Like believe whatever you want, whatever works for you. Right. But for me to understand and try this on as kind of a new approach to looking at like how the Bible talks about consciousness. Like there's an encoding. All of these lessons are encoded in myths and stories and archetypes. And of course, we're not taught that either, about how to decode some of these myths, right? We're taught that, for instance, like the goddess to me was just as fantastical as a unicorn, right?
Yeah.
But yet God, right, was the masculine divine, was like, here I was like shaming myself my whole life and guilty and sinning and right. And when I started really understanding it, it's like, oh my God, like sin is just forgetting, like is missing the mark.
Right. That's
it's
the literal interpretation in Greek, is missing the mark.
Right. So obviously we could chat forever here.
I love it.
So much.
Well, when did repentance become about shaming? Because repentance is just reconnection to yourself, to the divine within.
That's right.
And somehow, I don't know if you played this program. I'm kind of reading between the lines. You did, because you mentioned this. I just had this image of a male God who was watching my every move, waiting for me to do something wrong, because I was here on earth to learn. And I was taught in one breath, you're here to make mistakes and learn and repent and come back to God. But I was never taught that I'm already there, that God would never leave me. I didn't have to be worthy to have his companionship or her companionship. And there was never a mention of her as a companion. But I was taught that how I was being tracked. Mm-hmm. And things were being recorded.
Like Big Brother, right? Like,
something
like creepy.
And so it became like very psychologically damaging, that I never felt that I was ever approved. Like, you're okay. I would get these feelings and they would say, well, if you feel the spirit, that's God's way of letting you know you're okay. But I was never taught that I was okay to begin with, and that it was just that companionship was coming in as a compassion and like, you're never really broken to begin with. And that might seem heretical to some people, because we are all broken, but it has nothing to do with our worthiness.
That's right. That's right. And actually it's the brokenness, right? Because you were talking before about the messiness, right? And, you know, if we were to actually look at the fact as well that, like, enlightenment, or if you look at like the lotus, right? Or if you look at so many things in nature, no grit, no pearl, you know, no mud, no lotus, right? It's this idea of like, true enlightenment is born in the mess, right? The awakening happens through the mess. And if we were to also understand that the mess is feminine, and for women, we've been taught not to go to many places. And it's because that's where our power lies. We've been taught.
Give me an example of that.
Okay, sexuality, messy. We've been taught not, you know, that it's sinful, that it's wrong, that it's right. Like, for a woman to be
dirty,
in pleasure, she must be a whore, right?
Yeah,
like,
it's the vehicle of temptation. It's bad, it's dirty.
It's messy, and it's right? Like, okay, that's one example. The body, another one. Don't trust your body emotions, right? Like, oh yeah, it's like, don't.
Like, if you're experiencing this messiness, you're not spiritual. You're doing something wrong. Otherwise you wouldn't feel that way.
Yes. And that was continually mirrored back to me, you know, that, well, what is it about that person that, you know, bothers you? Like, it was never like anybody had my back. It was always like, well, you must be doing something wrong then. Right. Like, it was crazy making.
And then how do we get rid of this out of you so that you'll really feel spiritual? But if you really, and I know you've studied this because you just said the mess is feminine. I could not agree more. We talk a lot in this podcast about the dark feminine and what that actually means, which is the messiness, the underworld. You talked about it. You had to go to that underworld, didn't you?
And nobody's got anything on you anymore when you have gone into that dark place and faced all of your shadows. It's very rare, right? Other than with my kids. And when they call me on something, sometimes I'm like, oh, ouch, right? Like, you know, you're right. I am. You know, I am, but it's rare for people to be able to like wound me with something that it's like, I can look at it and be like, yeah, you know, that's true at times. Right. Like, or for them to be able to use something against me. Like, you're so sensitive. It's like, thank you. It's true. Right. It's like a compliment.
But if you earned the right, you went into the underworld, you were down, you came, you know, we're always going in an ascension and descent process, but like you earn the right to know who you are because you went to the underworld.
Yes.
And that is the heroine's journey, the hero's journey, whatever you call it. When you come back with that elixir, to me, that elixir that Joseph Campbell talks about, that's knowing who you are.
Absolutely.
And you are not the same anymore. You can't sit in a space like a church, for example. I love church. People don't misinterpret this because I know religion is beautiful, but you don't need an exterior stamp of approval to let you know who you are anymore. You got that directly from source, from God, from spirit, however you define that. So how did that look? How did you grab the elixir?
Yeah. Well, I love that you brought up the hero's journey because, of course, one of those books is Maureen Murdoch's The Heroine's Journey.
And I've interviewed her on this podcast.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. Love it.
So good. Well, and of course, and the heroine's journey is different from the hero's journey. Absolutely. And again, like for us to really understand that as women, that is so important, right? Like it's so important that we understand that our purpose in the world is the feminine and what we value, right? And because our quest is one of for wholeness.
Sure.
Right. It
Women
is
Seeking Wholeness, the podcast.
Exactly.
That is the quest. Actually, what if I say this a lot? What if you were a little kid sitting in church and you were taught that you're already whole? That you actually didn't even have to search for it. That there's nothing that you would ever do, no matter who you are, where you've been, what you've done. You're whole. What if we had gotten that messaging very early? Right? And bless our parents, they didn't get that messaging.
No, I mean, this is a legacy, right? Of breaking the chains of, really people who've been enslaved basically in some strange form in this trance, right? Sure. It's truly, I think, being able to awaken in this way and remember, right, the truth. When I love how language works, right? It's like remember, right?
You talk about this. You call it disrupting the trance of unworthiness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love that because we're all in this trance of like, And if you study neurolinguistic programming, they do literally say we're all asleep. We've been in a trance. And when you have one person in a mess or in a group who all of a sudden has new lenses they're looking through, right? That person looks like the black sheep. That person looks like the disruptor, the revolutionary. Mm-hmm. That person actually is the most awake. Mm-hmm. And I would never profess to say I'm awake because I know it's a process. I never want to put a chasm between me and someone else who's not looking through the same lenses because we all have our own traumas. We all have our own experiences and patterns and DNA and whatever. But I have to say, when I went through that descent and I was working my way through, germinating and gestating, if you will, in the underworld, it was like, I cannot go back to sleep now. I cannot look at this world the same anymore. Mm-mm. Something happened. It was like the film that was over my eyes just started to dissolve.
Right. And suddenly, like terms like you can't unring a bell have a whole new meaning, right? It's like, oh, yeah, I can't forget now.
I can't go back in the trance. I can't go into coma, right?
Yeah, not the same way, because it's really interesting because the trance continue, like if you don't kind of have a structure, and this is what I love about women and the circles women are providing and what we're doing right now and how we're circling and how we're leading.
Yep. We're galvanizing forces.
Yes. Right. Is this new practice of continually remembering, because if we don't continually remind each other, right, in a way that's very different. I talk about this context, setting context for women to be together in a completely different way, of course, than the way we've been trained to be together. And so it's this idea of like, we're not in this circle to fix each other. We're here to celebrate each other. And it's about practicing this radical self-approval constantly, and because we forget, right? We could be, Let
me play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
Okay. Because I was taught that, and actually the patriarchy does not want these groups of women. They do not want that. In my religion of origin, Mormonism, you have to literally have like a priesthood holder who's only a man preside over even groups of women. And also in the home, the man is taught to preside. I'm not even kidding you.
I know.
And I never felt comfortable. Like when I was at girls' camp and we're like burying our souls and there's a man right there. It's like, why can't you just leave us women alone? Why can't we just be together?
Because that's too dangerous.
It is dangerous. And I think on some level, they don't want women to rise to that wisdom power that we inherently have.
They don't. I mean, this is really, it's very, very like I love what you're pointing to, because it's like, well, surely this isn't really real, but it's like, well, then why else? Why? Do you know what I mean? Like, that's absurd. That's absurd.
It's ridiculous to me now, but I was so conditioned with it that I thought that presiding priesthood male was equal to God. And that women didn't have that same connection or power or authority. And it's still perpetuated very, very subtly. It's like, no, you have access to this power, but no, I don't actually hold it. Because if I did, there wouldn't be a whole guideline from the church saying that a male needs to be with groups of women.
Well, and once you really understand that the Crusades were built on destroying anything that had any reference to the divine feminine, right? Like there's a systematic way, there's a scaffolding here that keeps that power in place. And so, yes, gathering with women in these circles and practicing a new way of being with one another, a much more natural way for us to actually be together. So you said you were going to be devil's advocate. What were you?
So okay. Thank you for bringing it back. I got so on a tangent there. So for you to say, okay, we bring these groups of women together and then we practice this radical inclusion and self-compassion, which is not happening at the highest, most religions are not inclusive at their core. They're very polarizing and marginalizing. If you don't behave these ways, you're not part of our group. So, which is not what Christ was teaching. But anyway, so in my devil's advocate, I'm going, okay, here's the argument that comes back to me. Well, then anything goes and you can get deceived by Satan, because like, if you're so accepting of everything and everyone, where are the boundaries of morality? So that's my devil's advocate. I have my own response for it, but I would love to hear what you would say to that.
Yeah, well, I just think it's so interesting, right? Because that is a very conditioned, right, way of kind of that fear, right? And if we think about fear is at the very center of the power. Because if you can be kept in fear, now let's think about what fear is. Fear is when you separate, is when you forget that you are both human and divine, and that you don't need an outside, validation or an outside connection to the divine. It's inside of you, but you've been taught otherwise. You've been taught that the divine is somehow out there. And so and even though your mind knows this, right, or logically, right, there's some aspect of this that literally seeps into our cells. That is a cellular trance. That is a cellular trance. And so when this is this forgetting and remembering again, because if we are connected to the fact that we're both human and divine, and I look at "and" as a sacred word, that I get to be
in the Gnostic text, that's anthropos in Greek, which means fully human, fully divine. It's all over in the Gospel of Mary. Keep going.
Well, and anthroposophy is a love of Sophia, as is philosophy. Anthroposophy, which yes, and so is philosophy is a love of Sophia. But these words, these terms got suppressed. They got
patriarchized.
Narrated. Right. All of that. Yes.
I have never thought of philosophy in that context, but that's beautiful.
Yes.
So
it's a
what
love
is
of Sophia.
what is the threat then? Okay, so if fear is about control and the psychic split, like you're saying, that rift between us not being divine, that something outside of us that's out there.
Right. And so
not what Christ taught at all. He, even if you look at just the canonized New Testament, he was saying the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God is within you, because it doesn't come by observation. It doesn't come out here looking.
I want our listeners to also, what does Christ mean?
It's a title, anointed one.
It means consciousness.
Okay.
It's like when we talk about being Christed,
sure.
Right? Like when you look at the death and the resurrection, right? Again, as an allegory, I'm not saying that there are literalists who believe that, right, that this is not an allegory.
Right. There's just a lot that we don't know through the Gospels, because they weren't even recorded by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were recorded a century after Christ's death almost by other people.
A lot of us actually don't realize that Mary Magdalene was the first apostle of Jesus. And, and
she was to me, and I've said this on this podcast, we talk a lot about Mary Magdalene. She was a Christed female.
Exactly. And in a lot of cases there you have that masculine, feminine, divine, that partnership, right? That's so sacred. And so to kind of come back to this circling, it's like, as women, for us to keep remembering, right? To keep each other remembering, right? That it all gets to belong, that I get to be messy and magnificent, that I get to be, that the whole world is a paradox, that it's supposed to be, that there's
what if what's happening is actually the ideal?
It is the ideal.
It's so perfect, right?
Yes.
The message.
I mean, if we look at what's going on in the world right now, when we think about, I mean, I don't know if this gets too crazy, but when we even think about the forces that have been at work over the past, especially 4 years, and we think about what has been revealed in that time period for us to look at more closely, and that the world suddenly just came out with some virus that made us all settle down and pause and stop the world, right? Like, hello, is there not some divine choreography here?
Right. Even if it came through nefarious means, it's still like Donald Trump, right? I mean, people have different opinions on him. I personally feel like he has a lot of misogynistic tendencies that he's tried to gloss over, and other people have too. But it was still perfect that we get this cowboy in the White House to shake it up. And like you said, the virus, even if it was a total conspiracy, planned Illuminati. I don't even read that stuff, but I know there's I get people sending me stuff, and I'm like, you know what? I don't care, because I'm going to say this. I'll tell you what's triggering me worse than anything right now. So you have these literal zealous religious people who, like you said, are taking everything so literally. They literally think they are better than everyone because of what they believe, and that they can't wait for the world to burn so that their righteous selves can be lifted up. And I'm saying this is across the board in most religions right now, because that polarizing thing is happening. So they literally can't wait for this rapture, or this be lifted up and taken away, because they're so great and righteous for what they believe. And they want to wipe everyone else out. They want the messy to go away, because it's some psychological way that makes them better. That's them. I can't stand it anymore.
I know. It just means that you've forgotten to laugh, because it is so damn absurd.
Here's ridiculous.
And here's what I want to say about that. If we were to actually look at even the word apocalypse, what does that mean? Right?
Apostle? I don't know.
No, apocalypse means to reveal.
Okay.
It means to lift the veils. Right? So what we're all experiencing is a revelation project. That's what we're experiencing.
That's a great reframe. Apocalypse is lifting of the veils.
It's to reveal. That's what it means in Greek. And so and in fact, all of this is being revealed. It's also, this isn't happening to us. This is happening for us. But we get the ultimate choice, right? That is our free will, is to choose how we're going to interpret how are we going to perceive this? And to go back to what you were saying, it's like so many of these, literalists, I will say, right? Extremists, because it is a form of terrorism. And at the core of it, I believe, is fear and scarcity, because that fear is what separates us. And it's what makes us believe the lies of scarcity, which is that more is better, that this is just the way it is. Right. And that there's a third one. And of course, Lynn Twist is the master of this, she has written a book called The Soul of Money. And of course,
did she write The Power of Eight too? I think I have that.
No.
Sorry.
Okay. So, and
I have the book, The Soul of Money. I just haven't read it.
Oh, yay. Yes. It's so good. But it's this idea of like, money doesn't have a soul. We have a soul. And it's like, when you look again at patriarchy, so I'm going to kind of do a little segue here, but here's what I want to, so we're bringing up kind of money. Okay. So I look at money as economy, right? And I look at the construct of the patriarchy as like capitalistic, but we have a form of payment, right? We need an economy, right? Yeah. But we also need, not at the expense of our ecology. And what we've been forgetting, again, divine feminine, is Mother Earth. So when we remember that we're both human and divine, we can also create a new world, meaning, however you want to take that, metaphorically, whatever. But it's this idea of having, just as you would if money is masculine and ecology is feminine, or economy is masculine and ecology is feminine, there needs to be an integration of the two, because we've been plundering Mother Earth, right? In this quest for power. And it's like, there is plenty for everyone. And again, going back to this fear of scarcity, fear of being wrong, fear of messiness.
For a lot of people, it's shadows. Because we have such a deep need to belong, we will create all of these constructs. Like, I don't want to get left out. What do I need to believe so that I don't get left out of the special people? For me, it was being favored of God. That has been a theme my entire life. And I didn't realize it was like spiritual elitism or egoic, really, spiritual ego, to want to be one of God's special people. But that was conditioned in me so young. I didn't realize how it was leaving out 99.9% of the population for me to hold and espouse that kind of a belief. And not only is it unchristlike, but it's terrorism. Like you said, I'm glad you called it terrorism, because what kind of God would annihilate most of his children and population to have a select group of special ones, right? But again, that need to belong.
Yeah.
And to come back to our spiritual home is so integral to our spirit, regardless of whether we have religious beliefs or not. And I can see how that gets perpetuated. The more that the earth is, like you said, the more that we're coming back to this remembrance, it's shaken up some systems. And some people are doubling down on that, right?
I know.
Let it burn, let it go. We need a person in the White House to save us all. No, we don't. We need to integrate the masculine and feminine inside of ourselves and include people.
That's right. And there's a way that he becomes his own archetype, right? And again, what are the lessons there? You've got to look a little bit more deeply and understand that sometimes people are symbolic of what is needing to happen. They're a mirror, right, for our unfinished business. And so it's it all depends on how you choose to perceive it. And that becomes your free will. And that's where I think, again, like all we can do is speak what's true for us and hope that it reaches the ears of somebody that starts to question. And when we question, we disrupt the trance, and what we've been taught is the blind faith.
Systems, yes. In some of these closed systems, it's like, don't question, doubt your doubts, and have faith. Don't use your brain. Just don't question and just accept, because this is the way God wants it.
Yes. And yet your body holds the wisdom. And so for how long was your body telling you?
Oh, every time I heard that phrase, I'm like, that doesn't feel right. What?
Right. And then we're told not to.
Person, gosh dang it, I'm curious. There's nothing wrong with that.
And thank God, because that became your mechanism for unlocking, right, the keys to your own liberation.
Which I'm still trying to do. Aren't you? Like
every day.
You don't get there. You don't arrive there. It's a practice.
Not only is it a practice, but it's like you said, I love too that our seasons, everything out here mimics what we go through inside, right? Mm. So nature is always reflecting back to us, right? Like that death and rebirth process. I mean, it doesn't always have to look like a smackdown. And in fact, part of the reason I'm doing this work is so that more women don't find themselves in that place, right?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you're saying that, because in saying that you have to go to the underworld, there are some women who are like, they don't know they've already been in it. They don't know they've lived in it. Mine was seasonal. It was marked. I could put it was in my astrological, like everything was lining up for that awakening or descent. But I just want to tell the listeners, like, embrace that. You may have already been through it, and now you just need to give yourself that permission to know you're whole, that you can trust yourself, that you do hold that wisdom. I just have to read this quote that I keep on my desk that my sister sent me in the mail.
Yay.
It's by Holly Holden Love. She said, and then one day she simply stopped waiting to get there or be more or work it all out. And she laid down on the grass and drank in the beauty of the messy wonder that was her life. Mm. And that's what we're talking about, right?
Totally.
I think the patriarchy would be like, hey, if you do all these things, you'll feel this way. And that's so masculine. There's no nuance in that. It's so transactional. Let's go back to that. Spirituality is not transactional. It's messy. And I was just noticing a post from my friend Gaynalyn the other day. She was talking about how faith is messy. No one wants to talk about how messy faith is. Just like be clean and packaged and put in a box.
Yeah.
Creation's not like that. Like you were saying, birth definitely is not like that. Sexuality is not like that. Mm-mm. Sexuality is not transactional. Emotions. Mm-mm. So let me ask you this. You talk about this being the Sophia Century. Mm-hmm. And we talk about Sophia on this podcast here and there, and it is synonymous with wisdom. It also could be divine mother, but there's a Pistis Sophia. That's one of the Gnostic gospels. And that's traditional, feminine, of course. But why is this for you? Why do you lead with that this is the Sophia Century?
Yes. Well, so first of all, it's a term coined by Lynn Twist, and she's a mentor of mine. And, and again, divine choreography there, story for another time. But it's really fascinating. Like when you think about the fact that the 20th century was all about war or the fear of war, right? The 21st century, and we've been really, I think, talking about the return of the divine feminine. Well, the return of the divine feminine is known as Sophia, right?
Yes.
And so this now is like the century of wisdom. When we think about wisdom, okay, I love this. It's like I think about the goddess Athena, and I think about the fact that Athena was accompanied by an owl, right? And why an owl, right? Well, an owl what makes an owl wise is its ability to cleave through the darkness and to come back with a higher perspective from having had the darkness. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at the Sophia Century and you look at the darkness of war and separation and the fear of scarcity and the fear of war or right, like
sure,
we're learning, we're remembering, right, that we're remembering what love really is. We're remembering what unity really is. We're literally remembering that we are both human and divine, and that in order to have a better world, there's also this beautiful prophecy that has been talked about for centuries, and it's about the bird of humanity. And the right wing is the masculine wing, and it's overdeveloped, and it's in fact become violent. The left wing, which is the feminine wing, has not yet been fully extended, and it's kind of had atrophy, right? And so the idea is that the bird of humanity, that this century is all about strengthening the left, the feminine wing, so that the bird of humanity can soar, so that it stops flying in circles.
I love that. Such beautiful imagery. Mm-hmm. I think to even bring that back to, I love archetypes. I love how they, like you said, how they mirror back to us what we need to heal within ourselves. I also think, and this is just me, but I'm just a little nutty this way, but I'll create my own explanations of the archetypes. I love reading what everybody else says, but when I think of the owl, it's like, who, to me, it's like questioning and going, ooh, it gives me that permission that the wisdom comes through the process of inquiry. So we're kind of just, yes. And when you study the life of Christ, he was always asking the question back to the person. And in his own way, he used archetypes because he taught in parables, yes. which are very archetypal. They're not literal, yes. They're nuanced. So if somebody came and asked him a question, he would say kind of like, well, what do you think? Instead of, this is the way it is. There were sometimes he walked in and talked, like when he was throwing the money changers out of the temple and stuff, where he would literally just show his humanness and tell it like it is. But for the most part, he was always trying to reflect back to whoever was in front of him. What's your perception? What do you think?
I always say that a good coach will not give you your answers. A good coach will ask you powerful questions so that you find your own answers, right? Yeah. And to me, that's what Jesus was, right? He was an advocate of the inquiry, right? He was an advocate of the mess. He was an advocate, right? He didn't deny his humanity or his divinity.
Right. But we have whitewashed that.
Yes, we have.
He was a man, and he had passions, and he was probably married to Mary Magdalene, and he had a temper. He was real. And I loved what you were talking about. And I wrote it down, that the story of Jesus was an allegory of ascension and Christ consciousness. See, when he was always telling the apostles, like, greater things, what did he say? Greater things than you've seen me do, you can do, kind of a thing. I can't completely quote it, but it was like he was always teaching. And especially if you look at these companion Gnostic texts that were burned and buried by the Catholic Church back in the day, the Roman Church, that we didn't get into our canonized scripture. It was not fodder for, like, I heard an expert talk about this. She's like, do you know how close we were? Like, what if just one of these texts had made it into the New Testament? How different our culture would be for women, how different, everything would be different. But like you said, this is the time to remember what was lost. Like you said, a remembering, a reconfiguration of the parts of ourselves that we've denied, and also how the patriarchy has sort of wiped out this whole gift of wisdom, embodied wisdom, that is going to actually, like, it won't be pretty to see what happens in the next century. It'll be super messy, but I'm excited.
Yeah. Well, I think, those of us that really do kind of trust that process, right? Who've been through our own messes, right? Like, again, that idea of the dark goddess that you pointed to earlier, which is so profound in terms of like understanding just how strong we are as women. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's also like this really, maniacal intelligence to silencing women and keeping us, you know, in this double bind of not enough or too much, right? If we're constantly perpetually kind of obsessed with our own worthiness, we are, when you think about it, we're the top influencers in our families, in our buying habits. Like, think about what we as women, if we're asleep and we're inside of ourselves and we are basically allowing all of this to be the way that it, right, without questioning it, then we're buying into it literally and metaphorically.
Yeah. We're being complicit in our own subordination.
Exactly. In our own subjugation, our own subordination. And so what I want to say to our women listeners today too, is like, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility once you know better, right? If you're hearing something that resonates today, go do your research, right? Because part of this, I'm hoping part of this conversation is just disruptive enough to really have you, right, like, look. And if you want resources, if you want resources, I've got a free gift that your
let's talk about it. We do need to wrap up because I was like, I feel like I could keep blah, blah, blah. So yeah, let's go there. Let's talk about, because there's so many rabbit holes we could go down. There's just such rich, that's just like this open field for discovery. And I would also remind the listeners, like, there's a movie called Smallfoot. It's a Disney movie. And I love it because it's allegorical for me of, you know, being in this closed community where this is all you knew and you don't know there's this whole other world. And there's a song from it that Zendaya sings, and it's always are is curious. There's nothing wrong with that. It's called A Wonderful Life. It's a beautiful song. And I would listen to that over and over when I would start to feel like, is this okay for me to step over here? Is it okay for me to read this thing? Is it okay for me to question this? So I that would be my shout out to listeners as well. And I love what you brought in too, of just trust yourself, trust your mind, your questioning, healthy mind, trust your body, trust your womb wisdom, trust the sensations you're getting in the body when you're told to believe or obey something that just doesn't resonate. And this is not a slam on systems or religions at large. What it is a reclamation to come back into your own knowing, because that's all you have when it comes down to it. Okay, so how can our listeners find your offerings, Monica?
I've loved this so much.
Me
so like
too.
you, I mean, I could just go on and on. This is obviously a subject I'm deeply passionate about. So I have a couple of resources. You're welcome to them. If you want to follow me on Instagram, I'm at Revelation Woman. And then if you want to go to the website, it's jointherevelation.com. On Instagram, there's what I call the Trance Busters resource guide. It's from trance. It helps women go from trance to transcendence. And it kind of celebrates my love of books as a feminist scholar and somebody who's deeply passionate about the divine feminine and really deconstructing the patriarchy. I've basically put together hundreds of resources in different categories that women, film, books, online links, so you're welcome to check that out. And it's always growing. So it just kind of gives you a place.
Yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast, because most of my episodes are interview based like this. I probably do a solo episode, maybe every 5 or 6 episodes, but I love leading women to other women who are part of that awakening in a non-confrontational, like angry, it's the wave, the former waves of feminism And bless their hearts, they've been so productive, but they never gained traction because they were fear and anger based, I feel, a lot of the time. But now we're entering this new, and bless their hearts, they paved the way for this new wave of feminism, which is to come back, like you said, and come back. So I love bringing women, other women who are doing that in a way that's productive and inclusive, non-polarizing, but yet also like laying it down, right? Like you got to be bold about this. This time.
Right. And I totally love what you're pointing to too, which is right, that the distinction for me is polarizing, because I think anger is a very appropriate emotion, right?
Totally. And we've been told not to be angry because that's not spiritual.
And that's very messy. It's messy to be angry. So again, there's a lot of ways, again, we've been steered to be a certain way because our power is actually over here. So it's been a bit of smoke and mirror. So I just want
to need to rise up with that righteous indignation, that righteous anger. It's not hurting anything.
In some cases, purifying.
Yes, very cathartic too. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, Monica.
Thank you. This was amazing. Totally. I look forward to doing it. And I want to have you as a guest on my show.
I would love it. Hey, thanks for hanging in there and listening to this long episode. I think I'm going to be working on releasing the fear of having to know everything and do everything. Just that whole perfection stuff, right? Forgetting who we really are, which is a fully human, fully divine, and having this experience that we chose to have so we could learn and expand. Thank you again for listening to Women Seeking Wholeness. And remember, you can find Monica Rodgers on therevelationproject.com. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you next time.